Hello and welcome. These recordings are designed for students sitting the CIE IGCSE History exam. And today we will go over one of the more common Part C questions found on Paper 1. You might find it useful to have a pen and paper to hand, or it's okay just to listen through as part of your general revision. The question we're looking at today is, why did the Second World War begin? Now, you will have studied this as part of your Collapse of Peace unit, but you need to be aware that for this Part C 10-mark question, for which you will get about 20-25 minutes, it could come up in a variety of different ways. As we know, Part C questions always have a statement followed by the question, how far do you agree? So this question could come up with one of today's factors. For example, it might say, appeasement was the main reason for the Second World War. How far do you agree? Or, the Treaty of Versailles was the main factor in bringing about World War II. How far do you agree? So you need to have the skills and be flexible enough to turn this argument around to directly answer the question. But for the sake of covering all bases, today's question will be quite generic. Why did the Second World War begin? If you've listened to any of my audio recordings, you will be familiar with what we call PEE. That is to say, every point we make in this answer will have its own separate point answering the question. It will be backed up with evidence in the form of names, dates, statistics, quotation, people, places and events, and we will then go on to explain the point. Phrases such as this shows or this suggests are helpful connectives in achieving this, and better answers will often give more than one layer of explanation. We call this PEE 2.0 because you're doing it twice. So in this response we will use the PEE formula and we will give a 5-part scope. So, why did the Second World War begin? Point 1. British and French appeasement. Evidence to support this includes: it can be argued that Hitler was an opportunist who would have backed down if Britain and France had had a harder line towards him. Evidence for this is shown by his orders during the reoccupation of the Rhineland in March 1936, which was one of the biggest bluffs of the 20th century. Of this, an American journalist, William Shirer, commented, quote, "Oh, the stupidity," unquote, in 1940. Moreover, Hitler's plans for Lebensraum or living space in the East had been made quite clear as early as December 1924 in his book Mein Kampf, which he wrote in Landsberg jail. German spending on rearmament had increased from 7.4% in 1935 to 23% by 1939. And historian A.J.P. Taylor in the 1960s claimed Germany was actually not that far ahead of Britain in 1938, and that they were only 45% of what British intelligence reported. For example, in 1939, Germany had 70 craft in the Navy, whereas Britain actually had 75, although Chamberlain was not to know this, of course, only what he was informed. Neville Chamberlain, Birmingham's first Prime Minister, famously stated in September 1938, quote, "How horrible, fantastic it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country of whom we know nothing," unquote. Peace in our time, therefore, did not include Eduard Beneš and the Czechs, and so Britain and France sold the Czechs down the river. Moreover, appeasement scared the USSR. Hitler had made no secret of his eastern expansion plans, and the policy of appeasement sent the message that the West would not stand in his way, which paved the way for the Molotov-Ribbentrop Nazi-Soviet pact, and thus made war more likely. So in explaining this wealth of evidence, you could argue that appeasement was a key factor in bringing about the Second World War. Point 2. The Treaty of Versailles. Evidence to suggest that the Treaty of Versailles was a key factor in causing war in 1939 includes: Versailles had left many ongoing issues which helped lead to conflicts. Some of these included the 3.5 million misplaced German speakers in the Sudetenland. The Anschluss had been banned, and historically Germany and Austria had close ties in terms of language, food, and many other areas. The Tsar plebiscite of 1935 had led to reunification with the German Reich, and the French and Belgian invasion of the Ruhr in 1923, which came about, remember, because Germany couldn't afford reparation payments of 6.6 billion UK pounds, left Germany feeling defenceless and gave rise to even stronger views about the need for eventual build-up of armed forces. And so you could explain this evidence by suggesting that Versailles was a key factor in causing World War II. Point 3. The Nazi-Soviet Pact. Now, you could link this point to point 1 about appeasement, but evidence to support this includes: the Nazi-Soviet Pact meant Hitler could have avoided a two-front war. It was agreed between the two powers that they would divide Poland between themselves. This pact gave Stalin time to prepare for war, and both Germany and the Soviet Union anticipated future conflict because they were ideological enemies. You don't get much different than fascism and communism. David Lowe, the New Zealand cartoonist, produced a famous cartoon in which Hitler deferentially refers to Stalin as the scum of the earth in 1939, which you may have seen in your history classes, and the Nazi-Soviet Pact was signed on the 24th of August 1939. And so in explaining this point, you may wish to argue that it was the Nazi-Soviet Pact, which links to British and French appeasement, which was the key cause of the Second World War. Point 4. Hitler's fault. This is the traditional point of view in explaining World War II, and evidence to support this includes: well, it's quite obvious that Hitler was the aggressor. In February 1933 he began rearmament, and in March 1935 reintroduced conscription in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. In June 1936 he sent support to the nationalists in the Spanish Civil War as part of Operation Condor, and in March 1938 the Anschluss was declared, again in contravention of the Treaty of Versailles. In September 1938 he invaded the Sudetenland and we had the Munich crisis, and then in March 1939 he invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. In August 1939 the Nazi-Soviet Pact was signed, as we know, and so by September 1939 Britain and Germany went to war. So in explaining this point, you could argue that actually World War II came about not because of appeasement, Versailles, or the Nazi-Soviet Pact, but because Hitler was hell-bent on war and on destruction. Which brings us finally to point 5, increased militarism. Evidence to support this point includes: German military expenditure went from 750 million marks in 1933 to over 17,000 million marks by 1938. German warships increased from 30 to 95 in the 7 years after 1932, and in the same period German aircraft increased from 36 to 8,250. And soldiers in the German army went from the 100,000 set at Versailles to 950,000 in the same period. Britain began to rearm significantly from 1937 when Chamberlain came to power, and introduced conscription in April 1939, so there was definitely increased militarism in Europe. And so in explaining this point, you could argue that it was the increased militarism of European nations that led to the Second World War breaking out. So we have given a 5-point scope to answer the question, why did the Second World War begin? British and French appeasement, the Treaty of Versailles, the Nazi-Soviet pact, Hitler's fault, and increased militarism. And so now it's time for a clever conclusion to tie it together. In 1945, Winston Spencer Churchill declared the war was Hitler's fault. And this essay agrees with him and this traditionalist point of view to an extent. Hitler was clearly the aggressor. However, it revises his opinion to include other factors, and instead agrees with historian A.J.P. Taylor, who in the 1960s argued that it was more the fault of European leaders. Hitler was an opportunist who would have stood down if he was stood up to, as the events in the Rhineland, when he gave troops the order to beat a hasty retreat if they were stood up to, prove. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I hope you found this useful. If you did, feel free to follow me on Twitter at Mr. Guiney History, or you can subscribe to my YouTube channel for further pieces of advice. Bye bye.